back at the conference on artificial intelligence and the common good. At this central moment of the day, we will be having our keynote speaker, Dr. Gyula Klima, who was born in Budapest, Hungary. He's had a number of postdoctoral positions at Helsinki, St. Andrews, and Copenhagen. Later, he was hired at Yale University in the United States, subsequently at the University of Notre Dame, one of my alma mater, but landed his current position with the Jesuits at Fordham in 1999. But we still accepted him here at Hackney, where he's been a full professor since 2002. He founded and still runs the Society for Medieval Logic and Metaphysics, and he edits, along with Professor Alex Hall, its proceedings. And he's recently started in directing the new Research Center for the History of Ideas, as RCHI, or Archie, in Budapest. Today he's going to speak to us about the very philosophically asked question, what is AI for? After his presentation, we will have a presentation by Father Adrian Catherine from our faculty, who I will briefly introduce before he gives his talk. At the end of both of their presentations, we will hopefully have time for interesting questions and interactions. So, to begin this middle section, let's give a warm welcome to our speaker.
Kind introduction, the invitation in the first place, and my homework assignment, which was the title of this lecture. So this was actually assigned by Sister Helen, and Sister, I did my homework. Here it goes. Okay. So I'm going to read the lecture mostly off the screen in order to keep within the allotted time, only occasionally inserting some explanatory remarks. But in any case, I hope it will be easier to follow also for you if you can see it on the screen. Okay? So here goes. The question posed by the title of this lecture can be understood in the first place as a question about matters of fact, which therefore cannot really be answered a priori in terms of some philosophical musings about artificial intelligence. In fact, some of the uses of that AI is put to may be known only to a very few people, perhaps in the darkest recesses of the Pentagon and similar institutions worldwide, unfortunately. Also, besides our factual ignorance of many facets of the answer to the question, we should also consider the huge variety of AI systems, not to mention the speed at which they are developed, perhaps preventing the very possibility of providing a simple, uniform answer. After all, the uses of various AI systems range from medical to educational to commercial to military, which seem to be working toward many different, particular, perhaps even incompatible ends, such as healing versus killing human beings. However, couldn't we perhaps still designate some common purpose of which these multifarious particular ends to be achieved by AI are just different particular realizations? Couldn't we, in the vein of Aristotle's considerations at the beginning of his Nicomachean Ethics, also search for this common purpose that as such is one and the same for all, even if it is realizable in so many different particular ways, much like human happiness, eudaimonia, as such is realizable in so many different particular ways in different individual human lives. After all, this is precisely how Aristotle's argument evades the possible trap of the so-called quantifier shift fallacy. Just because it is true that all roads are leading to some place, it doesn't follow that there is a place that all roads are leading to, right? Nevertheless, if it is true that all roads are leading to the same place, say Rome, then it is also true that there is a place that all roads are leading to. And of course, it doesn't really matter whether that common goal is numerically one and the same, or merely formally realizable in individually different instances. Indeed, just to illustrate, all people shopping for shoes are looking for the best shoe size, namely the size that best fits their foot. But given the differences of their feet, even if in a way they are all looking for the same thing, namely the best shoe size, the particular number that realizes the best shoe size for each may be quite different for them. This fact, however, will not destroy the community of their one common goal of finding the best shoe size. So this is formal unity as opposed to numerical unity. Formal unity, which is realizable in so many numerically different instances. Okay, this is going to be an important idea. But then, if Aristotle's methodology is appropriate, as it certainly is, for finding a priori, through a philosophical investigation, the common human end attainable in this life, namely eudaimonia, based on what the function of man is and determined by human nature, then we can analogically also launch a speculative philosophical inquiry into what the common end of various AI systems is, or indeed should be, based on what the common function of various AI systems is, as determined by their artificial nature, which in turn is determined by us humans. The quotation marks around the phrase artificial nature will be significant later. Okay. Now, this rather complicated sentence immediately raises at least two important issues. In the first place, the normativity necessarily implied by the very nature of artifacts that I indicated by referring to what the end of AI should be, rather than just what it is. And in the second place, the analogical ways in which we are speaking about the nature, functions, and consequent ends of artifacts in general, as they apply to artificial intelligence in comparison with human intelligence in particular. So let us take these two issues in turn. So first, the normativity implied in the function of artifacts and the common good. Regarding the first issue, it should be obvious that all artifacts as such are supposed to be instrumental in human life, and as such, they may have their proper uses and abuses in accordance with or going against their intended purpose, or even purposes, in the case of a multifunction device such as a cell phone, which can be used for calling, chatting, navigation, etc. But it is abusive to use it as a hammer to drive in a nail in order to hang a picture on the wall. So even if it is possible to operate an artifact abusively, when that happens, it is not used for what it should be used for. Thus, when we are raising the original question of what AI is for, we should also heed the normative element concerning all possible uses and abuses of all artifacts, implicit in what they should be used for, namely the betterment of human life. But considering it from this general perspective, explicating the normative character of the question, we can easily answer what AI, just like any other artifact, should be for, namely for the common good. For the betterment of human life cannot be just a singular, solitary effort in a zero-sum game against others. Pacha hops. On the contrary, it can be fully realized only in win-win situations, in collaboration with others, in various human communities, ideally, in the last analysis, in the community of all humans. Indeed, this is why Thomas can say with Aristotle, bonum commune est divinius, quam bonum unius. The common good is more divine than the good of one. But then the question immediately arises. How can we secure this common good in the use of artifacts in general and in the use of AI in particular? This is a question that directly leads us back to the issue about the nature, functions, and ends of artifacts in general, and of AI in particular in its comparison to human intelligence. Now let's see then the nature, functions, and ends of artifacts and of AI. As Aquinas often reminds us concerning natural agents, the essence of things come to be known from their activities. However, in the case of artificial agents, the epistemic order is just the reverse. Since in the case of an artifact, it is the human agent that determines the nature of the artificial agent, normally we know what it can and cannot do and what it is best apt for doing, which is its proper function. As Aquinas says, our intellect knows the essences of artifacts that have never been seen by investigating from the aspect of the end to be achieved what are required for that artifact. Accordingly, we should be in a much better position concerning an artifact whose nature and functions we determine for our purposes. After all, that is precisely why we constructed it in the way we did, because we wanted to construct an agent that best serves us to achieve our intended end by using this artifact as our instrument. So, what is specific about this artifact, artificial intelligence, in comparison to human intelligence? First, let us start with what is better known to us, the operational differences between human intelligence and AI in general. AI, despite its apparent autonomy, whether in action, as in the case of a self-driving car, or in cognition, as in the case of chatbot, providing us with summaries and relevant bibliographies of any topic we are interested in, being an artifact, as its name says, is no exception. To be sure, given its complexity and built-in stochastic unpredictability, it is a more complex task to determine exactly what an AI system can and cannot do, and just how it would operate under unforeseen circumstances. But it is still just a man-made system working on man-made algorithms. Well, what does that mean? What is an AI system, and given what it is? What is it that it can do for us or against us? And how can we deal with all the possibly unforeseen implications of its use? These are rather nagging questions, so let us try to handle them systematically one by one. As I just stated, the very notion of artificial intelligence determines its genus as an artifact, even if it is capable of some sort of self-development, which may possibly slip out of our hands if we don't really know what we are doing in developing it. What makes it, however, precisely this kind of hard-to-handle artifact is its specific difference, namely, that it is some kind of intelligence, quote unquote. That is, in some ways, it exhibits behavior that we would recognize and classify as being, in a way, intelligent, again, between quotes, where the quotes indicate the difference between proper and analogical ways of speaking about intelligence. It is at this point, therefore, that we should exercise extreme caution in our use of the language describing AI systems. Similarity, or even formal identity of certain functions, does not entail similarities, let alone identity, in the mechanisms carrying out those functions, even in artifacts. Just because the same apps using the same user interface are running on Android and Apple phones, or on Windows and Apple computers, it doesn't mean that they are carrying out the same instruction sets on the machine code level. As the old adage goes, si duo faciunt idem, non est idem. If two do the same, it's not the same. So, just because an AI system apparently intelligently answers our questions, it doesn't mean that it is the same kind of intelligence at work in the system as that working in a human mind when we get intelligent replies from a human interlocutor. Just because we get the same type of output and intelligent answer for the same type of input for the same question, it doesn't mean that it is the same type of information processing that is taking place in the same type of information process source. So far, so good. But then, what is it exactly that makes the difference in these processes and mechanisms due to the obvious generic difference between a human being and a human artifact. Now, in several earlier papers, I discussed in detail one of Aquinas' arguments for the immateriality of the human intellect, namely his argument based on the intellect's universal mode of representation. Here I only want to allude very briefly to the gist of the argument, especially because it most clearly relates the operations of the human intellect to its nature, and because it immediately provides some basic insights into the metaphysical differences between the nature and operations of the human intellect and AI. So perhaps the simplest way of reconstructing the argument is presenting it as the following syllogism in Barocco, in case the logically well-heeled audience members recognize it as valid syllogistic form. Presupposing in its premises a system of natural encoding resulting from natural causality. It is again going to be very important. That's why I emphasize natural encoding as a result of natural causality. First premise, all representations that are material in their being are singular in their information content. Second, some intellectual representations are not singular in their information content because we form universal concepts that are not singular representations. Therefore, some intellectual representations are not representations that are material in their being. So, our concepts are immaterial, and so is their subject, the human intellect. Since the conclusion obviously follows from the premises, and the second premise is agreed on all hands, after all, almost all the catagrammatic words I have used so far in this lecture are expressions of universal concepts. The only questionable premise is the major premise, which seems to jump from some mode of being to some mode of representation, which would seem to make it open to the charge of the so-called content fallacy advanced by Robert Pasnow. By the way, the written version of the lecture contains all the necessary references indicated, so you will be able to look these things up when the written form of the lecture gets publicized. Okay? Now, according to Pasnow, and the fallacy would consist precisely in the move from the information content of a carrier of information to its ontological properties, its mode of being, and vice versa. However, even if in the case of artificial encoding, in which our minds can relate just anything to make the former the encoding of the latter, in the case of natural encoding resulting from natural causal processes, this move does not have to be fallacious. After all, in natural causal processes, not anything can just cause anything. And so, in a system of natural encoding, the nature of the cause and its effect may determine what can encode what and how. This is precisely the gist of Aquinas' argument, based actually on the famous Aristotelian idea, just a signet-print making an imprint in a piece of wax. That is an instance of natural encoding, where the effect represents some features of the cause in its own way. Now, in sense perception, our senses are naturally attuned to receiving information about their proper sensibilia, as vision is attuned to receiving information about colors, hearing about sounds, etc. But what singularizes this information as the color of this thing or the sound of that thing in my perceptual field is their so-called common sensibilia, namely their spatiotemporal features, such as shape, dimensions, spatiotemporal location, perceivable by several senses, such as shape, which can be cognized by sight and touch as well. This is the case because all the proper sensory modalities affecting our respective senses exert their causal impact precisely as determined by the spatiotemporal material features encoded by corresponding spatiotemporal material features of our sense organs. If I have two eggs in my visual field, then I will see them as distinct individuals because their individual colors will affect different areas of my retina. But it is precisely this feature of sense perception, namely that the material individuating conditions of sensible features of material objects are encoded by corresponding material features of our sense organs, that provides the intuitive basis for the first premise. To be sure, one might think that in the further stages of processing this sensory information, the singularizing information can be eliminated, and then we would get universal representations in the material medium of the brain. However, we might respond that as long as the further processing of this information consists in the natural causal modifications of the material carriers of all this sensory information, the information content of all these material carriers may become less distinctive, but never truly universal, because they will still be causally traceable through their causal histories to the singulars they originally derived from. So even if a picture of this egg or that egg may seem to be indifferently representing either this or that egg, but if it is a picture of just one of the eggs, it is traceable back to that egg. It is still a representation of that egg. Even if based on the information content of the picture, we would not be able to distinguish the two. We are going to get into this issue maybe later in the discussion period. So, what is needed for truly universal and not merely non-distinctive singular representation is an agent outside these causal histories that is capable of operating not only on the material carriers of information, as any other material agent would, but that is capable of operating directly on the information content of all these material carriers in esse intenzionale or spirituale, as Thomas would say, extracting what is essential to the represented objects. This is only how genuinely universal representation of natural kinds, and hence natural science, is possible, through grasping the essences of a potential infinity of things of the same kind, X-raying, as it were, the intelligible skeleton of human experience in general. For more detail, consider the following diagram describing both the semantic relations among our universal terms, concepts, and singular things, and the cognitive processes establishing them. So this is actually a diagram that is coming from my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on the medieval problem of universals, describing this much enhanced Aristotelian semantic triangle from the point of view of the so-called via antiqua, the old realistic way of interpreting this Aristotelian semantic triangle, as opposed to via moderna after Occam, providing much simplified, but in a way metaphysically dumbed down interpretation of the same. But I am not going to get into that topic today. I've written quite a lot about that. Here is just a very sketchy presentation of the basic idea of the via antiqua semantic triangle. The material singular beings acting on our senses produce phantasms, the singular representations of singulars in the common sense and sensory memory. These, in turn, serve their information content for the abstractive operation of the intellect to form the first universal representations, the intelligible species, which provide the intelligible content of the universal concepts that apply not only to the singulars they derive from, but to a potential infinity of them of the same kind, sharing the same form, the same essence. So, in this diagram, the gray arrow The gray arrows indicate the information processing of singular sensory or sensible information received by our senses as it gets into our internal senses, especially common sense, and in humans, also the so-called vis cogitativa. Those are still all brain processes. However, in order to produce the first universal representations, the so-called intelligible species, we need an agent that is able to X-ray, as it were, I said, directly the content of all these material representations, finding what is essential in this database of sensory information, and deposit these intelligible species in intellectual memory, which can then be used to activate our mental acts, these subjective or formal concepts, these individual acts of cognition, whereby we can represent universally in our objective concepts the absolute nature of these individuals, which can then be applied to all individuals, even unperceived earlier. That's why scientific prediction is possible based on this kind of essential abstraction. Okay, now the next couple of slides would deal with a nominalist objection coming from John Buridan, the great Parisian master of arts, and here is a Thomistic response to this, but in the interest of time, I would really have to skip these, perhaps return to these slides in the discussion period. The important thing is to distinguish between merely indifferent representations and truly universal representations in the mind. Now, for now, let's just grant Aquinas' argument, and let's just assume his conclusion that the intellect is truly immaterial, which means that it is not received in the mind or the form-body composite of a human being. The human soul is a substantial form of the body that enlivens the body, that animates, that coming from the word anima, right? For Latin for the soul. And so this animating principle, the substantial form of the human body, has a number of acts that are, and powers and acts that are common to the form-body composite, such as an act of sight, an act of hearing, etc. Obviously, that would involve the living eye, optical nerve, optical cortex, etc. But then, when these neural firing patterns in the brain can be X-rayed, as it were, again by the agent intellect. The agent intellect is a power of the soul alone, not of the soul-body composite. So this is how Thomas gets out of the avaristic conception, by the way, that we can have our individual intellects that are still immaterial and yet individualized, because these immaterial intellects are individualized by the already individualized material forms of our bodies, namely our souls. Okay, so much for a very long story about the nature of the intellect as it was discussed by Thomas and Latin averarists in the 13th century. But without going off on tangents, I will not discuss Aquinas' argument in further detail. It gives us enough food for thought as it is in relation to our original question. So returning to my homework assignment again, for if Aquinas is right, and truly universal representations of our intellect cannot be produced in a material medium, in the sense that they cannot be obtained by the mere material manipulation of the material carriers of sensory information obtainable by our senses, or any sensors for that matter, then it should be obvious that our material computers will never be able to pull off this feat. They cannot abstract, they cannot form essential concepts by essential abstraction. But then the previous metaphorical remark about the intellect X-raying the intelligible skeleton of all human experience brings to the fore the following four more specific features of human intelligence, at best mimicked by artificial intelligence. First, the human intellect's relation to human sensitivity. Second, as this relation is realized through its social character. Third, being embedded in social practice. And fourth, as governed by genuinely free, autonomous choices. In what follows, let me take these features one by one, contrasting them with corresponding features of AI to see what we can learn from these comparisons about their functional differences, always with an eye on the original question of what AI is for. Now, human intelligence in its relation to sensitivity versus AI and its relation to its sensors. Of course, the human intellect is working in tandem with human sensitivity, which includes not only the receiving and recording sense data through its external senses and sensor memory, but also the integrative and creative functions of the common sense and imagination, just like in more advanced brute animals. What human sensitivity and the human intellect add to these animal functions is the turning of the resulting sensory representations, the phantasms, by the vis cogitativa into singular intentions, which in turn are already pre-sorted by the sensory power for the agent intellect's abstractive operation to tease out, as it were, however confusedly, their essences. At any rate, this is how Aristotelian cognitive psychology describes the natural cognitive process, producing the first universal representations, the intelligible species, the principles of concept formation, and hence the categorization of sensible objects, sorting them into their various kinds. The point is that this is an organic natural process, ending up, if Aquinas is right, with classifications possible only in an immaterial medium. AI systems use various sensors, including LiDAR, radar, and ultrasonic sensors, providing information unavailable to the human senses. They are even capable of integrating these various sensory modalities for object tracking and re-identification. However, for the classification of these objects, they are ultimately dependent on human input. Labeling the objects for classification, although for various further techniques, they are also capable of autonomously fine-tune these classifications, filtering out various errors in the training process. But the classification is ours. There are actually human teams training these systems for object recognition, as in the self-driving cars. That is a lamppost, that is a pedestrian, that is a policeman, so slow down. Something like that. But again, if Aquinas is right, then the basic natural process of simple concept formation is metaphysically unavailable to these systems. But this takes us to the second point, namely the social character of human intelligence. Because even the basic natural processes of simple concept formation in humans, as outlined in the foregoing, is far from the end of the story. Human concept formation is essentially a social business, as is demonstrated by the cognitive deficiencies of feral children growing up in isolation from human society. There is enormous literature on this. This is highly recommended for anybody interested in this particular point. So, the basic natural process is just a necessary precondition in the developmental psychology of human beings, the power of which can only be realized in a human society that develops a language and culture that provides their children with access to the intelligibly articulated experience of countless previous generations and growing up the opportunity to further develop this intellectual cultural heritage. AI systems, even if they can communicate with each other, as human artifacts fit into our human social context, but they have no societies, no histories, no conceptual developments of their own that we humans do. And the reason we have this is that conceptual developments are part and parcel of our social practice, our form of life as social animals. So humans are not only zoologicon, but zoologicon in its full operational state cannot be possible or is not possible without the zoon-political human being as a social animal. So let's see human intellectual activity as social practice. Philosophers, especially in modern times, tend to look at intellectual or mental activities as essentially cognitive and hence receptive, and especially in the modern milieu of post-Cartesian philosophy, as basically individual enterprise. After all, only I am aware of my ideas, and so my ideas are entirely my own alone. That's it. This is the starting point of modern individualism. Nothing can be further from the truth now. Living as social animals, we are constantly sharing, exchanging, and reshaping each other's ideas, and thereby our own, just as we are doing right now, right here. Furthermore, by sharing and reshaping our ideas, we are prompting our actions driven by those ideas. Just think about what is happening in election campaigns and how elections have consequences, famous phrase, reshaping our entire lives, ranging from trifling changes to matters of life and death, even war and peace. Nothing like this is happening in the, however, well-connected AI systems, not living in a society of their own, except in our society, working for our occasionally radically conflicted particular goals. And this brings me to the last point of comparison, the free choices humans make and the imitations thereof in AI systems. On the practical side of human life, as opposed to its merely receptive cognitive side, we have another immaterial power, namely the free will, which enables us to perform genuinely autonomous actions, imposing moral responsibility on us. After all, any agent, even a non-voluntary natural agent, is causally responsible for their actions, which, however, does not carry moral responsibility. The actions of non-voluntary natural agents are determined to them by their nature and their circumstances, but they are not determined by them, sometimes even contrary to their circumstances. As Plato beautifully described this contrast toward the end of his Phaedo, Socrates' bones and muscles would have been already far away from Athens on the night of his execution, if it had been left to them to determine Socrates' actions, and had it not been for Socrates' choice to stay and teach a last lesson of heroic patriotism to the Athenians. Our takeaway from this concerning AI should be the following. First, just as in the case of the intellect, AI systems will never have the immaterial power of human will, and accordingly, they will never be able to perform the kind of genuinely autonomous action imputable only to genuinely autonomous agents, and thus, the responsibility for their actions is on us, humans, no matter how much their action may mimic human autonomy. To be sure, AI systems are a specific kind of human instrument with much more flexibility in their actions than, say, Philippa Foot's or rather Judith Jarvis Thompson's runaway trolley, which it is the direct responsibility of a human agent to direct one way or another with a lever. But no matter by means of how many intermediaries and how many mostly stochastic processes the behavior of AI systems is determined by humans, it is ultimately determined by humans, even if humans may easily lose direct control over that behavior. So, to conclude, the human risks and benefits of AI. To summarize, all AI systems, including future AGI systems, artificial general intelligence systems, will always be the products of human intelligence, serving human goals and carrying human responsibility for their actions. As such, they will have their proper uses and abuses, just as any other human instrument. Even if, in their behavior, they may eerily mimic intelligent choices, they can never cross the metaphysical barrier between the activities of the immaterial powers of the human soul, namely intellect and will, and their material stochastic capacities of information processing, aided by the adaptivity of neural networks, the near inexhaustible databases of the internet, and exponentially increasing computing power. These quantitative increases will never amount to crossing the essential qualitative differences for the reasons listed earlier. But these qualitative limitations of AI systems only increase the human responsibility to make sure that these systems are used in the service of the common human good, which is then our responsibility to investigate and implement, especially in view of the enormous new powers of AI systems, much more easily slipping out of our control than a runaway trolley or a so-called autonomous vehicle, or even more frighteningly, AI-controlled weapon systems, including those prepared for biowarfare. We just cannot really. So we cannot let those go wide. That is the important observation about this. Nevertheless, despite all these enormous risks, we should first acknowledge that the development of AI systems is now unstoppable. And so instead of some knee-jerk Luddite actions curbing their development, we had better understand their artificial nature and the resulting enormous potential they have for promoting the genuine common good by enhancing, without ever replacing, our intelligence. Thank you very much. I can go with.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to pass the floor for a moment to Father H. McCaffrey, who is a writer and convert from the Province of St. Alpha the Great in the United States, who has recently received his doctorate from St. Louis University, where I also used to teach, so bound in strange and interesting ways. He will provide a brief response to the paper we've just heard, and after that we'll open the floor to discussion by those present.
My thanks to Dr. Klima, whose scholarship and example has been tremendously beneficial to many of us here. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Dr. Klima puts his finger on the central question of our conference. Given that artificial intelligence, or AI, which is artifactual and not properly intelligent in Aquinas' view, is merely instrumental, how should it contribute to human happiness? Dr. Klima underscores this important point. Because AI lacks true will, it can never be held morally responsible for its actions. That responsibility will and must fall to its architects and operators, we human beings. While AI can simulate aspects of human cognition, it fundamentally lacks the intellectuality necessary for moral responsibility. It is always off the moral hook, so to speak. In my brief time, I'd like to cover 2 points. The first, Pasnow's objection and Dr. Klima's powerful response to it. And the second, and very briefly, a matter concerning transhumanism. Robert Pasnow is worried that Aquinas and others fallaciously infer something about the metaphysical nature of thought, namely that it is immaterial, from the content of thought, that it is universal, immaterial in its subject matter. It's sort of like saying that because Alice is thinking about infinity, her thought must be infinite. But just thinking about infinity doesn't make Alice's thought infinite. No more than her thinking about universals makes her thought universal. Pasnow calls this the content fallacy, the mistaken inference from the content of a thought to claims about what a thought is. But Pasnow says that because you can represent something universal in a material medium, for example, a brain state or a computer bit string, you can't conclude universal representation requires immateriality. Dr. Klima, however, gives what I think is a powerful reason for concluding that Aquinas is making no such fallacy. Aquinas, he argues, is not saying that the intellect is immaterial because it thinks about immaterial things. Rather, Aquinas is saying that the intellect's mode of operation is universal in its way of representation, and that such a way of operating can't ever arise or exist in the way of matter. He's not saying the intellect is immaterial because it thinks of immaterial things, but rather the intellect is immaterial because it operates in a universal mode, that is, a mode or kind of operation that can't exist in matter. Why not in matter? Dr. Klima explains that matter only operates in particulars, because all causal interaction in material sense perception is governed by spatiotemporal material conditions. He is saying that the sense perception, or material encoding, is necessarily individuating because they function by material causality. Anything material is here and now and this. We can call this Aquinas' particularity principle. The particularity principle is the Thomistic claim that all material operations necessarily yield particular individuated effects, because matter must operate under spatiotemporal quantitative conditions. But many contemporary philosophers of mind are computationalists or functionalists, people who endorse the view that cognitive processes are computational or comparably so. They resoundingly reject Aquinas' particularity principle. They argue, for instance, that if a computer can process and manipulate symbols representing universal concepts without being tied to specific material conditions, it suggests that universality doesn't require immateriality. But Aquinas and Dr. Klima with him would argue that symbol manipulation isn't the same thing as intellection. For Aquinas, intellection is never just moving symbols around, but always about grasping forms. Aquinas would say that even the most sophisticated AI model can't abstract universals from singulars, because it is always bound to material causal chains. Matter is always about thisness, never about whatness. All of its representations, therefore, must be particular. They are tokens, never universals. They are particular signs pointing to particular material events. AI is necessarily, then, a closed material chain. Only an agent with immaterial powers can step outside the causal series of material events and operate on intentional forms as such. Dr. Klima puts it this way: what is needed, he says, is an agent outside these causal histories, capable of operating not only on material carriers of information, but on their intentional content, extracting what is essential to their represented objects. What Dr. Klima shows is that material processes are metaphysically incapable of producing universal content, grounding the argument in how cognition actually works. Contemporary philosophers like to distinguish between strong and weak AI. Engineers and AI experts who endorse strong AI hope to create artificial persons, that is, machines that have all the mental powers we human beings have, including phenomenal consciousness. Engineers and AI experts who endorse weak AI hope to create information processing machines that only appear to have the full mental repertoire of human persons. Dr. Klima's argument aims to rule out once and for all strong AI success. He says it's metaphysically impossible. Various analytic philosophers over the last few decades have developed arguments against the idea of strong AI. Most popular is John Searle's Chinese room argument. Just as a human person in a room can follow instructions to produce Chinese language responses without knowing a scrap of Chinese, so can a computer manipulate symbols according to rules without understanding their meaning. Searle says that the computer's operations are syntactic, not semantic, meaning the operations run according to rules of syntax, not according to the meaning of statements. This argument, however, tends to be rejected entirely by AI experts today. It's rejected because they claim, rightly, in my view, that Searle doesn't explain why semantics cannot emerge from or even equate with syntax. Here's a metaphor. Syntax is like ink in a book. Semantics is the meaning one draws from the sentences. It doesn't matter how much ink is provided, for you never get meaning without a reader. Semantics can't arise from syntax because meaning is not a property of material arrangements, on Dr. Klima's view. Meaning is a feature of intentional cognition, of a subject agent capable of grasping a form as form. Syntax, lacking the immaterial intentional act by which something becomes about something, can model or point to meaning, but can't itself mean. While philosophers who endorse naturalist accounts of meaning would certainly reject Dr. Klima's conclusion, their own accounts must still demonstrate how meaning, which cannot be a property of syntax, emerges. Dr. Klima's argument, in my view, very neatly complements James Ross's famous 1992 paper about the ambiguity of the physical. Ross asks us to imagine Alice adding 2 and 2 to get 4. It seems very clear what Alice is doing when she adds 2 and 2 to get 4. But when we look inside Alice's brain at her neurons firing, say, can we really point to a specific physical state and say, this is the act of Alice, adding 2 and 2 to get 4? Ross says we can't, because Alice's brain state could be connected with a different process, a mistake, a malfunction, and so on. Both Ross and Klima argue that matter is bound by causal conditions, while Ross emphasizes that material causal conditions prevent unambiguous formal meaning, ruling out rational precision, whereas Klima emphasizes how this limits representation to particulars, ruling out universality. Together, especially, they present a robust and devastating critique of strong AI and also of reductive materialism. Of course, this raises a question that Daniel DeHaan has helpfully pressed in recent work, namely, how an intellect that is immaterial and universal in operation can nonetheless know singular material things. Dr. Klima doesn't address this here, and it's a live issue among Thomists. But Aquinas does have a line of response. The intellect, while unable to grasp the singular as such, can apply universals to singulars by returning to the phantasm. So while the problem of singular cognition is real, I don't think it undermines Dr. Klima's core claim, only that it points to further work Thomists must do to articulate clearly how universal cognition and sensation cooperate. I am all but out of time. I'd like to now allude to transhumanism, or a philosophical movement that aims to use technology, including artificial intelligence, to transform, in a radical way, the human being so as to overcome his or her biological limits, disease, aging, death specifically. Transhumanists imagine a world where the human animal is so merged with the machine that it is in fact perfected, and in some cases transcended, in which a so-called post-human state arises. Obviously, Dr. Klima would say that the possibility of uploading our consciousness into machines is metaphysically off the table. But Dr. Klima seems to insist there's a use of AI that is compatible with human flourishing. We might then accurately distinguish between weak and strong transhumanism, where the former provides medical or cognitive enhancements that aid natural powers or overcome certain overcomable limits, whereas the latter runs somewhat beyond this. The human animal, we can say, is apparently capable of such artificial augmentation. I'm thinking of Elon Musk's Neuralink, or neurotechnology that allows communication between brains and computers for the sake of treating neurological disorders, for example, paralysis, blindness, memory loss, but which requires in its mechanism the use of AI. It seems to me Neuralink potentially straddles the boundary between weak and strong transhumanism. I'd be eager to hear what Dr. Klima suggests metaphysics offers this conversation, to see in what way it provides the apparatus necessary for distinguishing legitimate enhancement from morally irresponsible technological overreach. Say that weak transhumanism aims to enhance so as to repair, extend, or amplify human powers by artificial means. Such technology, much of which makes use of AI, might provide AI-assisted prosthetic limbs, neural implants to restore speech, retinal chips to restore vision, cognitive aids that supplement rational deliberation. In such cases, enhancement serves human flourishing, and as such, may be morally permissible and praiseworthy. But strong transhumanism, although it also enhances human powers, does so in ways that are morally deformative, not by altering human nature, which such technology cannot do, but by directing technological means toward ends that frustrate true human flourishing. The metaphysical question, then, is whether Klima's Thomistic account can supply principles by which to distinguish enhancements that serve our nature from those that, though not metaphysically impossible, prove morally impermissible. Thank you.
We now keeping on time. We probably have about 10 minutes for questions to give you then 5 minutes or so maybe to get to the next things so you can keep the day moving along. So I think there are not automated but intentionally moving microphones about the room. Right?
May I perhaps start with 2 very quick reactions to Father's comments. One would be a strengthening of Sellers and Ross's argument, because their point basically is that you cannot read semantics off syntax, right? Whether the syntax is realized in marks written on paper, or vibrations of the air, or neural firing patterns. Now, this is true as long as we do not have a Rosetta Stone, right? From which, that is the code whereby we can decode the information encoded in these information carriers. But if we have some ways of finding out about the encoding processes, then we can have a good shot. And that is the hope of cognitive scientists and neurophysiologists trying to find out which firing patterns carry information about what mental contents, right? Okay, but I would rather shatter these hopes by pointing out that thoughts and concepts have radically different conditions of identity from the conditions of identity of neural firing patterns. Thoughts and concepts have logical conditions for the identity and distinctness, whereas these all the material carriers, the information about these thoughts and concepts, have their very different natural causal conditions of identity. So when when I decided to give this answer, it started out with a decision in my mind telling my brain to, triggering these relevant neural firing patterns in my brain to start the process of encoding my thoughts in this particular language. We are using English, which I could actually switch very easily to a different language, mondjuk magyarra, és úgy folytatnám. Let's say I could just change it over to different language, say Hungarian, and continue in that part, Latin, etc., which would obviously involve very different firing patterns of neurons, still carrying the same intentional mental content. So the conditions of identity and distinctness for these intentional entities is very different from the conditions of material entities in the causal processes of carrying out our mental commands, as it were. And this brings me to the other point about Neuralink, which taps into this chain of command governing human action at obviously a much higher level than any other enhancements of our senses and motoric capabilities, such as eyeglasses or cochlear implants or prosthetic arms and legs, etc. But it is still tapping into this process on the level of brain firing patterns, which, as I said, would have to be triggered by and encoding our intentional acts in an immaterial mind. So that is another strengthening of this position against strong AI and strong transhumanism. So that's it, very quickly. So, questions? I think Sarah?
Thank you for your speeches. I appreciate it. My question has to do with the potential abilities of AI. So I think that artificial natures can also be true substances, such that they are natures that have their own ends. For example, bread. It's an artifact, but it's also a substance.
For instance, what? Oh, bread. Okay. Yeah.
So do you think that
Is it properly speaking the intention of bread?
what's that?
Is it so? Even artifacts can have their inherent intentions, but is it really the intention of bread itself, or rather of the baker who wants to feed us with the bread?
I would say as a substance, it still has its own inherent physiology.
Yeah, okay, let's just go on with that.
So my question is that the algorithm of AI achieved to a high degree of perfection. Do you think that AI could ever achieve self-perfected imminent activity? I think it's a really important question, especially if the integration between technology and biology advances much more. Integration by Thank you.
Oh, I would certainly believe that AI can be perfected and even can be self-perfecting in many ways, especially if we also enhance its capabilities with what I would call conceptual modeling. I am actually working with some AI scientists on this. That is to teach AI the semantics of our languages rather than just manipulating the syntactical items of our language, etc., by transcoding whatever we are talking about into machine code. But if we have this conceptual modeling, there is going to be a much more refined way of intellectual operations in AI systems, which in many ways will be capable of transcending ordinary human capacities. But so such is the case also with a hand calculator, right? Just because it can perform long division much faster and with much more reliability than I would, that doesn't mean that the hand calculator is so much smarter than I am. And even in this particular function, the hand calculator is relying precisely on the accumulated human understanding of numbers and arithmetic and the capacity to provide algorithms for calculations starting with Arabic numerals, right? Try to do a long division with Roman numerals. It wouldn't work. So, and all that really started with, culminated in our being able to implement these algorithms in, basically silicon and computer chips. That's fine. But what is metaphysically impossible, if Aquinas is right, for these computers to pull off, is to produce their own simple concepts by way of abstraction from their sensors input and further development them in their society as we humans do. So these are the two main arguments that I would say. First, that I would say radically separate human intellective functioning from AI, namely the metaphysical impossibility of pulling off essential abstraction in a computer chip, because it has to take place in a material medium, and the social character of further conceptual developments. But once these concepts are genuinely implemented in the computers themselves, they can further process them much faster, untiringly, on much larger databases than any of us individually would be able to do. Yes?
I would like to get your opinion on this debate that around the term information. You know that some people claim, as cognitive scientists claim, that it is actually not fully correct to relate to human beings as processing information, and that there is no such thing as information in the brain. I presume you are aware of that debate, and so I'm wondering, seeing your talk, what's your perspective on that?
Well, we have to have a proper understanding of what information is before we can say whether there is or there isn't any information or information processing in the brain, or even in the intellect, which is distinct from the brain, if Aquinas is right. Okay, I actually have a paper on that. It's called Form, Intention, and Information. It came out, I think, last year or the year before. I'm not sure. I'll be happy to share that. In any case, the idea is that information is nothing but a form in esse intentionale in a cognitive subject. If I may just give you this short answer, and it can be expounded further by properly understanding what the intentional existence of a form in a cognitive subject is, as opposed to the real existence of a form as determining an actus essendi, as Thomas would say, an act of real being. And real form determining an act of being is an essence, or if it's substantial form, or the essence of an accident, if an accidental form, which is just determines how the thing is. Okay, on the other hand, form in intentional being is a form received in a receptive subject, which doesn't really have to be, in the first place, a cognitive subject. It may be just a medium. Aquinas is talking about the intentions of colors in the air. So whatever is encoding a form will be in esse intentionale, but it will become information when it is received in a cognitive subject, in which it is a determination not how the thing is, but what the thing knows or understands or perceives, etc. So in these various cognitive functions. And when it becomes part of the vital activity of this living cognitive subject, that's when we can talk about information in the proper sense. Information in the real world and information. This is a neat linguistic distinction. Information spelled with an E and information spelled with an I. These are both determinations, both forms, determining certain acts of being, but acts of being in the real world determine how the thing is, and the determination of an act in intentional being is a determination of how a thing cognizes something. So, properly speaking, only in cognitive subjects there is information under this understanding of information, namely as a form existing in intentional being in a cognitive subject. So even computers do not really process information. That is information to us. That is not information to the computer that it is processing. It is processing the carriers of information, yes, which is information to us, who can eventually understand, perceive, etc., and act on that information. Thank you.
We have one last question, which is sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Klima. If what you say is true, artificial intelligence could then be described as a golden, not made of clay, but of practical rare earth, alive because of the magic of the programming language, more or less, but falsely labeled as intelligence.
I'm sorry, I can barely follow you. Could you somehow? There was an echo or something. I cannot really quite. Yeah, let's try that. If you can speak up.
I want to ask whether it would be correct to label artificial intelligence as a more or less golem, alive because of the magic of programming language, and not made out of clay, but made out of rare earth and metallic earth, and only equivocally called intelligence. And my question is a little bit more, but very short one. Do you think this equivocal usage of the term intellect or intelligence is there in order to allow this golem to be a potential scapegoat for one politics or other things? Or do you think it's based on just intellectual errors or another kind of philosophical approach to this question?
Yeah. Thank you. Now I could hear you quite clearly. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I like this idea of golem. Why not? After all, it's just a metaphor of a metaphor. But that is precisely the issue when we are talking about artificial intelligence, qua intelligence. Perhaps it is not pure equivocation. That's why I was rather talking about analogy, analogical ways of speaking. And of course, in another paper about the same topic, I go into this in somewhat more detail, that these analogical ways of speaking are perfectly okay as long as we can keep track of how we are stretching our proper concepts to cover lesser known instances that do not properly fit under that concept. So, for instance, I can perfectly correctly say that, oh, my car just doesn't want to start, right? Or, oh, that is a smart dog there. But of course, it doesn't mean that the dog has the same sort of smartitude as a human person would, or the car would have a volition to resist my will. Okay, so that is, of course, not the scenario. But if we understand what, when we are using this type of analogical language, we can cover unknown instances of similar phenomena by stretching our concepts to the unknown instances. And so this is how we analogically speak about all sorts of cognitive capacities and functions of animals, or even superhuman intelligences, such as angels and God. We can learn a great deal about this by reading the scholastics again, about angelic cognition and action, and even divine intelligence and action. And they had very clearly delineated standards and rules for the analogical applications of our concepts to these non-human instances, which we, however, can reach out to by intellectually stretching our concepts further beyond their original proper applicability. There is a beautiful book by my former student, Josh Hochschild, on cogitans, the nominum analogion, the analogy of names, that covers a lot of ground in this field, which can also be interestingly implemented in a formal language in many ways. Okay, so I don't want to stretch this any further, but I would just like to stress the importance of keeping track of proper and analogical uses of our terms when talking about these unknown phenomena.
So thank